Welcome everyone to our special edition AMA with Roman Pichler, the author of Strategize and How to Lead in Product Management. He'll be asking your questions on strategy and roadmaps. Before we start with your questions, quick intro about myself and then about product people. I've been in product for about 11 years in various hands-on and product leadership roles, and throughout product people, I've supported digital-first publicly listed companies like Zalando or unicorns on their way there like Tier Mobility, and as well as other Series B plus companies with a very strong product focus. And how does this work? At Product People, we're on a mission to help companies discover and deliver great products faster. We empower the product management community to share knowledge generously through events like this, with managing the hands-on and glamorous work of a product manager on an interim basis. We onboard fast, align teams, and deliver outcomes. And some of the use cases that we cover is needing to scale fast your product team, which usually takes at least 3 months to get a full-time person in the door, or you have a parental cover or a sick leave for 3 to 12 months, or there's a sudden departure from your company, and the hiring is also going to take a while. We're also very excited to appraise and structure product teams and internal product processes, as well as leading temporary initiatives. And these are some of the clients we work for. Our very colorful and diverse team is distributed first across Europe, and we're hiring PMs at all levels, as well as a senior business development manager. So go to productpeople.join.com to apply. And now for the star of today's session, Roman Pichler is a product management expert who specializes in digital products and agile practices. He is the author of several books, including Strategize and How to Lead in Product Management. Roman joins us today to answer your questions on roadmaps and strategy. So these are the topics that I'll prioritize during our time with him. Thank you so much, Roman, for this.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, so while we wait for the questions to come in, feel free to start. Roman, what is a question that you wish you are asked, but no one else asks you, and asks you only the boring stuff?
Sometimes the apparently easy questions or easy things, aspects of product strategy and product roadmap can be pretty tricky. So for instance, we talk about a strategy for a product, we talk about a product roadmap for a product, but we sometimes aren't clear what a product is, particularly what a digital product is. Or maybe we are clear as the person in charge of the product, but maybe there's no shared understanding with the stakeholders and the development team members and other product people. So I think it's really super helpful to reflect on what is a product, and do I own a product in its entirety, or maybe a part of it, maybe a feature or an architecture building block, which sometimes happens, or do I actually manage and own more, like a product suite or portfolio, a group of related products. And so, product strategy and product roadmap really are about individual products. And an individual product, I would say, is an asset. So in a digital context, a piece of software, plus potentially additional artifacts that generates value for users and possibly customers, and for the business, and has to do so largely on its own. So I think, for me, that's really the first thing to reflect on. And in a way, something I wish I'd been maybe slightly more attentive to earlier on in my career. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And it's indeed something that we've also noticed, that people think in terms of, all right, I'm on this funnel, right? If especially slightly junior people, instead of thinking that the product for a customer means also the interaction they're having with customer care or customer support or whatever that client-facing department is named in a company. And even that, if it's not a super cool interaction as you would have with the Vault ordering app and a few apps who really excel at that, then that's also a bad product experience for them, even if the product department is not necessarily leading that. And in very few companies we've seen CS under product.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a second important aspect to include and involve the right people in creating and in testing, validating, and then reviewing and updating a product strategy, and similarly in building and adapting a product roadmap. So I'm a big fan of a collaborative approach of, as I said, involving the right people, the key stakeholders. And that might well be somebody from marketing, somebody from sales, somebody from service support, maybe somebody from finance for commercial revenue generating products. So, key stakeholders are those individuals in the organizations who we need as product people in order to make the right product decisions and move our product forward, not only to design and develop the product, but then also to offer it, to provide it. So very important to gather different perspectives and listen to people's views, even if we don't necessarily agree with them, but just to make sure that we have a holistic approach and we don't forget important aspects.
Thank you for that. And now we'll take Joe's Halter's question via YouTube. What are your thoughts on whether a story map is necessary as part of a well-run product, or can you realize the same outcomes with a different tool or approach?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Interesting question. So story maps or story mapping is a technique that my colleague Jeff Patton developed quite a few years back. And I think I'm not a story mapping and a story map expert, but from what I know about story maps and to the degree to which I've used them, they can be terribly useful. And the nice thing about a story map for me is that user stories tend to describe a piece of functionality largely in isolation. I mean, a user story tells a story about how a user or a customer, somebody who interacts with the product, uses that product or uses a certain aspect of that product, a piece of functionality. But user stories aren't great at describing connections between pieces of functionality. They aren't good at describing a multi-step user interaction, a more complex user interaction, or a workflow. And so this is one of the strengths of story maps, that we can really show how people are likely to interact with the product. So I think that can be really useful. I'm not sure that personally I would use a story map as a strategic planning artifact. I've personally always thought of, and that might be right or it might be wrong, as a story map as more a alternative to a traditional strictly linear product backlog. So more as a more tactical tool. Whereas for me, a product strategy and product roadmap will be strategic plans and strategic planning artifacts. So, personally, I'd say if you work with a story map, you may still benefit from having a product roadmap that offers a longer term outlook on the likely development of your product and clearly states the product goals you want to achieve, the product outcomes you want to create, maybe over the next 12 months or so. And then have a product backlog or story map that captures the detailed product decisions and is maybe focused on the next product goal, captures those stories that you have to implement in order to meet that goal and create the desired outcome. Not sure if that was useful.
Oh, we'll let Joe decide. I also agree with this. I think it's a great tactical tool. But definitely not a strategic planning artifact, as you said, Roman. Another question from Simon Charles Hanks on LinkedIn. Are there any best practices when managing a diverse and very extensive portfolio of smaller software products? And then additionally is prioritize and categorize and strategize. So Simon, feel free to add extra context to your question if you wish.
So a portfolio, a product portfolio is a group of products. Sometimes these are related products. Take, for instance, a productivity portfolio like Microsoft Office. I think the Office members of the Office suite are probably quite closely related. I mean, they're bundled. You can only subscribe to them as far as I know as a package. I think what is helpul to understand the relationship between members of a portfolio, and also understand at which life cycle stage the members of a portfolio, the individual products, are to try and achieve or create a balanced product portfolio. Ultimately, certainly across a larger number of products within any given portfolio, or in any company, you want to make sure that you have the right mix of young and old products, particularly, or older products, particularly if these are revenue generating products, so that you have enough cash cows to pay the bills and fund future innovation initiatives. Oh my God. It's coming up to 6 o'clock here in the UK. I must be tired or getting tired. Apologies. Yes, innovation initiatives. And at the same token, you've got enough young products that hopefully eventually will then grow and develop into cash cows, and so pay the bills in the future. So that's something to watch out for. The other thing to consider is dependencies, and think about where dependencies may be useful, and where do they hold you back and hold the development of the individual products back. How much in terms of norms and shared standards do you have to establish across that portfolio? So in terms of say user interaction and user experience in general, including user interface design. Are there any standards? Or what about things like, say, the ability to persist data seamlessly to various data storage services, including the cloud? And would it be useful to introduce some form of a platform? So that platform might provide then end user facing shared assets around the user experience and standardize the user experience, and then it might provide a back end infrastructure services assets so that the development teams that build the apps, that build the members of the product portfolio, don't have to worry about those kind of infrastructure related. Don't have to create the infrastructure related code, essentially. And then I find that it can be useful, particularly if it's a larger product portfolio, to have somebody in charge of that portfolio. Sometimes the head of product can act as a product portfolio manager, and help set priorities and help anticipate and manage dependencies between members of that portfolio. And sometimes it makes sense to have a dedicated person who then is in charge of that portfolio and does the work that I mentioned.
Thank you for that. And this is also something that it's usually very hard to do, as we know this in more mature companies. How do you make innovation not a crapshoot, or build alternate revenue streams, as we've seen in some companies that were successful for a while and then they didn't do much, and just relied on the cash cow, because it's always easier to prioritize those.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent, it's perfectly okay to pay attention to cash cows or core innovations. I mean, there are various ways how you can refer to those products that, as I said, pay today's bills. But at the same time, as you just said, if we're not willing to take informed risks and invest in new products, then it's kind of difficult to see where revenue is going to come from in the future. And that has to take place in terms of developing either brand new products or new products and services if we want to grow organically, or otherwise we have to look into acquiring businesses and then use their products and services and integrate them into our portfolios. But in both cases, we have to be willing to take a risk, and we have to actively sort of look towards the future. And again, as I said, getting that balance right, getting that mix of kind of young products and more established older products right, I mean, that will be the job of a product portfolio manager.
Mm-hmm. And now I'll take a few on the roadmaps. Modupe Odu Mosu via Zoom asked, what is the best prioritization framework you'd suggest to use for a roadmap?
The best prioritization framework. So I think in order to be able to answer that question, it's another great question. Thank you for asking those questions. I think the first step is to reflect on what kind of product roadmap I'll be dealing with, especially, excuse me, what product roadmap format. And so personally, I'm a big fan of goal-oriented or outcome-based roadmaps. Some people like to call them problem-based roadmaps or themed roadmaps or benefits-based roadmaps. I mean, to me, largely those terms are synonymous. You can use them largely interchangeably. And so if we have a goal-oriented or outcome-based roadmap where we talk about the benefits that we want to achieve with our product over, say, the next 12 months, something like we want to acquire more users, or we want to increase conversion, or we want to increase engagement, or we want to future-proof the product by removing technical debt, or we want to start monetizing the product and generating revenue, or we want to reduce cost, whatever it might be, then my first approach will be to look for semantic dependencies between those goals. And that works particularly well for young products and when you're making a bigger change to an existing product, in order to then create a meaningful narrative and tell a meaningful story through your product roadmap. So an example I like to use is offering a healthy eating product, a product that helps people eat more healthily. If I wanted now to create a brand new product, then the very first version, the MVP, might help people become aware of their eating habits, and maybe specific eating habits around breakfast. I'm told that breakfast seems to be the most important meal of the day, so maybe that's something we want to bring awareness to first. And then, we could consider maybe trying to encourage people to deepen their awareness and bring awareness to other meals, and then maybe help them start changing their habits. So, in that instance, the product roadmap will be driven, or the prioritization, the ordering of the elements, the information on the product roadmap will be driven by, how can we develop that product in a meaningful way, and how can we offer more value to the users in, again, a meaningful, convincing way. So that's what I meant by a compelling narrative. But if you have a product that's currently experiencing a phase of stability, or is maybe, we talked about cash cows earlier, it's maybe mature, and you now focus on incremental changes, updates, and bug fixes, smaller enhancements, then it can be a good idea to look at your KPIs, your key performance indicators, and use the indicator that currently shows the biggest issue in order then to decide, first of all, discover the right goal, determine what kind of outcomes are necessary or you should work towards, and then also decide on what needs to happen first. So, if you see, for instance, that code quality is going down, and maybe, the uptime has started to suffer as well, then that's maybe something you want to address first before you want to try and increase conversion further, or, increase engagement further. Yeah. So that'd be my suggestion.
Yes, and this is also something that's sometimes less visible to prioritize, investing in infrastructure, velocity, and efficiency, so you can then enable your next phase of growth as a company. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, I mean, sometimes organizations and individual product people struggle to make those future-proofing goals enough of a priority. But an example that comes to mind is the development of Apple Snow Leopard. I think that was quite a while back. I think that was sort of in the late 2000s, 2009 or something, that Snow Leopard was released. But Apple actually, it took Apple 2 years instead of 1 year, I believe, to get the operating system release out. And despite spending so much time on the new version, all they did is essentially ported their OS onto new Intel hardware, and they refactored. but that gave them a new improved basis for adding more functionality and innovating the Mac OS. And I think it's probably paid off for them. So I'm not suggesting you should necessarily spend 2 years refactoring your product, but sometimes it can make sense to spend maybe 6 weeks or 2 months cleaning up your code base, removing those parts that are particularly complex, contain a lot of spaghetti code, in order then to be able to add new functionality or enhance existing features. So something that might be worth considering. There's another thought that I just had around prioritization, and that is it can be really hard to not only discover the right things to do and capture them on your roadmap, the right goals or outcomes, but also to see relationships between them and then to prioritize the roadmap in the right way if you haven't got a strategy, or if you haven't got a validated strategy. So an overarching product strategy that has been tested and where you're confident that you've chosen the right need or main problem or primary benefit to address or to create, the right value proposition, where you're confident that you've chosen the right target group, the right audience, the right market segments, the right standout features, and the right business goals. And you've got data to show it. You've got data to base your confidence on. I think that's really super helpful. So you can then derive an effective product roadmap, and you can auto prioritize that product roadmap again effectively.
Thank you so much. And I'll take a follow-up from Philo Plicant on YouTube. What is your advice on how to get buy-in from stakeholders on a roadmap that is focused on goals and impact instead of features? Thilo is often asked for a detailed feature roadmap for quarters to come. I guess a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And traditionally, product roadmaps are feature-based plans. I mean, in the simplest form, it's essentially a list of features mapped onto a timeline. And if you do an internet search, or you maybe go to Google or Google Images and you key in product roadmap, most of the images that will come up are feature-based roadmaps. So it's still something that people are used to. It's still sort of the dominant roadmap format, but feature-based roadmaps tend to be, for me, it's something I used to say they're okay in certain scenarios. They're okay at certain life cycle stages of your product, but I've now kind of moved on, and I tend to discourage people generally to use feature-based roadmap, and generally encourage people, no matter how old or young or stable or changeable and innovative their product is, to use goal-oriented outcome-based roadmaps. So I think outcome-based roadmaps really are more stable. It's easier to achieve agreement around shared goals, or generally goals and outcomes, rather than detailed features. You minimize the risk that there's an overlap between, say, a story map or product backlog and the roadmap, and a number of other benefits that goal-oriented outcome-based roadmaps have. Now, how do you get stakeholders to buy into that road mapping approach if people are used to features? Well, I think to a certain extent, like with any change, it's just a process of people getting used to it. Sometimes it takes time for people to get their heads around it, and people have to experience working with a goal-oriented outcome-based roadmaps to really understand how this roadmap works, and be able to kind of build trust in that road mapping approach. But then, if it kind of persists, and if people continue to be hesitant, even though you've introduced the new road mapping format, the new road mapping approach, and you've kind of shown people how to create goals and how to work with goals, and they still say, yeah, but I want my features. What about my features? Then it's worthwhile reflecting on that and asking yourself, why is that? People sort of worried that their interests aren't being taken into account and aren't reflected on the product roadmap. Or people kind of acting in somewhat selfish ways, and they care more about their personal goals than the value that the product creates for the users and the business as a whole. And so if it's more around that people are concerned that their needs aren't being accounted for, then one way to do this, and it's something I would encourage you to try out, is to adopt a collaborative approach and run collaborative product road mapping workshops. They might be on site, they might be online, but really involving the key stakeholders and development team representatives in a joint session where you review a product roadmap and then you discuss any necessary changes and you make those changes together. And so as the person in charge of the product, you would essentially lead through that workshop. You might ask an agile coach or scrum master or another skilled facilitator to moderate, to facilitate the session. But you'd guide people through it, but you'd use a decision-making rule, say like consent, to ensure that there's sufficient agreement. And consent means that there aren't any meaningful objections. So you really give people the opportunity to contribute. And that can not only lead to better product decisions and a better understanding, a shared understanding of what those goals and what those roadmap elements mean, but it can also secure stronger buy-in. It tends to secure stronger buy-in if you invite people to contribute to a decision. But there are a couple of mistakes you should avoid when you adopt a collaborative road mapping approach. And the first one is to try and please everyone and take on board everybody's ideas. That's usually impossible. And if you try and do it, then it results in a compromised product, or in a worst case, a Frankenstein product. Looks ugly, has a horrible user experience and a poor value proposition. And the other mistake I see product people make is to allow the most senior stakeholder to dominate, and then the hippo wins, the highest paid person opinion. And again, that's not the point. That's not collaborative decision making. That's just, the most senior person decides. Collaborative decision making means that you leverage the expertise and the knowledge of the people present, but you make the right decision that moves your product forward in an effective way. So maybe try that.
That probably also moves towards the stakeholder management and alignment as a topic. Because I think when this situation happens, it's not necessarily a problem with the roadmap or the technique. It's more of managing up and figuring out how to align diverse groups composed of very strong personalities, which all PMs end up running into as part of their work job.
Yeah, that's right. It's called product management, but it's all about people, right? It's all about understanding users and customers and being able to empathize with the audience, the target group, the market. But it's equally important to understand the stakeholders and empathize with the stakeholders and understand where they're coming from, what their ideas and concerns are, and what their underlying needs and motives and goals are. And then, of course, you also have the development teams to connect with. So yeah, there's a lot of people stuff in product management, and hence it's really beneficial to develop our soft skills, our interpersonal skills, or our leadership skills. I do really think that practicing product people also have to show leadership and have to actively work to align and guide the stakeholders and development teams. As the person in charge of the product, you don't want to be driven by your stakeholders. You want to lead. You want to lead the way. And in order to do that, I think it's important to build trust and establish effective, good connections. I mean, the key challenge we have as product people is that we lack what's referred to as transactional power, right? We're not the boss. We can't tell the stakeholders what to do. We can't make the stakeholders agree to a product roadmap, for instance, or follow specific goals on that roadmap. So we rely on the goodwill and the cooperation of the stakeholders. But I think what we can do is we can influence people, but people are usually only willing to be guided by us and influenced if they trust us, if they know that we care about them and we wouldn't act against their interests, at least not knowingly, right? And so I think, the whole thing around building trust and relationship management and, empathizing with the stakeholders is hugely important. And if you can have the most amazing product strategy, you can have the most beautiful product roadmap. If your stakeholders don't understand those plans, if your stakeholders don't sufficiently buy into those plans, they're pretty much worthless. And that buy-in you secure by, as I said, the relationship building, the trust building, and by actively involving people in creating and reviewing and updating those plans. It's a great way also to align people. It's a great way to create shared goals.
And to give an example on that, because I think you've landed a very interesting point, and this is also what Gonzalo Santos on Zoom has a similar question on outcome-oriented roadmaps. Could you give an example of a before and after, so that it's also for the people here to get a sense of how this will look if they redo their roadmap? Sorry, I think I stopped sharing.
Yeah, sure. So it's obviously easier to kind of show you examples rather than to try and explain. But as I briefly mentioned earlier, a traditional roadmap usually has a number of pieces of functionality, larger pieces of functionality or features, product capabilities that are assigned to a timeline. And so you might say, you know, in the next month, we'll do these features, and then the following months we do those features, or, you know, in Q2, we plan to do these features, and then in Q3, we're going to implement and deliver those features, and so forth. Now, an outcome-based or goal-oriented roadmap turns that around and says, well, hold on a second. Why are we talking so much about the outputs, the deliverables, the what needs to be done? Of course, it's important to understand what we're doing, but isn't it more important to ask, why are we doing it in the first place? What are the benefits we want to create for the users and for the business? What are the outcomes we want to achieve? What are the goals that we're working towards, right? And the nice thing about, for me at least, and in the model that I've developed, the model that I use, the model that I teach, is that when you have an overarching product strategy and you have user goals, customer goals in form of needs statements in that strategy, and you have business goals in your strategy, you can take those goals and then you can break them into more specific, measurable, shorter term goals and put them on your roadmap. In that way, your roadmap is systematically connected to your strategy. So it's one of the benefits of having goal-oriented roadmaps. The other benefit is that, and I mentioned that earlier briefly, roadmaps tend to be a little bit more stable. Well, not only a little bit, they tend to be more stable when you focus on goals and you omit features, or, you know, if you use my Go product roadmap template, then you still have features on there, but they're very big, they're huge, they're coarse-grained, and there are only 3 to 5 features per goal, and every feature must support one of the goals. So you can't just squeeze a feature on the roadmap. There always has to be a goal that this feature serves. So goals come first,
brilliant.
Features second. And then it's easier to reach agreement on goals and shared outcomes rather than a list of potentially detailed features. And finally, you know, if you have detailed features, then often there's an overlap between the product backlog and the roadmap. And you know, in the worst case, those plans start to compete. And, you know, in the best case, you have an increased maintenance overhead for the roadmap, which is like, why? So roadmap should be a strategic plan, and then the detailed product decisions, they should be in the product backlog. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I think this also answers Angelica Testini's question on Zoom on the level of granularity on the roadmap, that if you have fewer things and a bit zoomed out, then you'll also have, and tied to a goal, then you'll also have a bit less work on updating and changing this all the time.
That's right. That's right.
So let me know, Angelica, in case you'd like additional details. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, that's definitely a great part of the answer. But I was still wondering if there's like a recommendation that you feel like giving on the optimal duration of a roadmap, like how much is too far? I usually tend to think that like 3 months can be something more granular, and then 1 year maybe can be a good duration, but I was curious to know if you recommend to go further or not based on your experience.
Great question. Thank you for asking. So I think there are a number of factors that can help you kind of right size your roadmap in terms of how far you look ahead. But as a rule of thumb, I would encourage you to avoid having speculative pieces of information on your roadmap. So basically, whenever you feel you can't look any further, you start speculating, you start really making some guesses, some wild guesses, stop. You're definitely looking too far. And so for digital products, often it's sort of somewhere around 6 to 12 months. So if you can, it can make sense to look ahead for the next 12 months. It can make sense to align your product roadmap with your financial years. Then you can use your roadmap also to acquire a budget, acquire funding if that's necessary for you. But then I've worked with a number of companies that offered products that consisted not only of software, but also of hardware and plastic. And in that case, often you need to look a little bit further because of the hardware and development cycles. They tend to be longer than when you develop and offer software only, purely digital products. So in that case, sometimes you have to look ahead 2 years. But yeah, for digital products, somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And the more uncertainty there is, the more change there is, the more innovation there is, both within the product and the market, the shorter in a way that the time frame should be that your roadmap covers. And if you're working on a brand new product and you can't look beyond the MVP, then that's cool. Then just state the goal for your MVP. And so you essentially have a roadmap that consists of one entry. I wouldn't probably call it a roadmap, right? You just agree on a goal for your MVP and maybe say these are the 3 key features that our MVP will implement. And then hopefully, as you get closer towards launching the MVP, you'll understand better what the next steps might be, and you might then be able to develop a roadmap.
Thank you for that. And I think it also touches on Stayer's 2 questions from YouTube on how you deal with the relationship between uncertainty and longer-term roadmaps. So thank you for covering that. One interesting question from Essen001, also on YouTube, before we move to 3 strategy questions so that we are on time. How do you think there are problems with roadmaps that we didn't discuss in the previous questions? And what do you think could be alternatives to that?
Yeah, no, it's another nice question. So yeah, I mean, product roadmaps. So I think product roadmaps can be incredibly useful product management tools. They can be really super useful for us as product people, but equally, if they're not applied properly, they can also be in a way harmful. So if people misunderstand a product roadmap as a hard and fast plan that is created and then is executed, and mistake the information on a product roadmap as hard commitments, and then insist that goals are met and dates and timeframes are met no matter what, you essentially turn a development effort into a death march. And the impact on people is horrible, right? I mean, people not only work extra hours, but people tend to get demotivated. People make mistakes. People are tired. Maybe people fall ill. Some people start to leave possibly the team or the company. So it's horrible. I've experienced it, and it's not a good place to be in. So I think it's really important to understand that, first of all, in order to create a realistic, actionable product roadmap, you have to have a strategy, a validated product strategy in place. I mentioned it earlier. That really is an important prerequisite. And secondly, you must regularly inspect and adapt. You must regularly review and update your product roadmap. And as a rule of thumb, do that once a quarter. So sometimes once a quarter is not often enough, and maybe you should shoot for bi-monthly or even monthly reviews and updates. Sometimes it's the cadence is too high, and you can get away with looking at it every 4 to 6 months if there's a lot of stability and your product is maybe pretty solid, very mature. But as a rule of thumb, maybe start with 3 month reviews, and ideally bring the stakeholders and development team members together, at least in form of an online workshop, discuss any changes that have happened, see if your product roadmap is still up to date, if it's still a helpful and valid plan. And if that's not the case, then, well, make the necessary modifications, the necessary changes. Yeah. So product roadmap should always be forward looking, and it has to be based on what we know right now. as our knowledge changes, the plan will have to change as well.
Thank you so much. And this also answered Rajesh Ravi Sankar's question on how frequently we should update or review the roadmap. And I'll move to the strategy questions. So far, we've collected two. One from Joe Halter, who also had a previously good question. How do you maintain support and stakeholder buy-in for your product strategy for an underperforming product or a product which is losing market share?
Yeah, wow, interesting question. So if your product is underperforming and possibly losing market share, you have a problem. That's it. So if your stakeholders are getting worried, well, I think that's okay. I mean, that's to be expected. I'd be getting worried if my product is underperforming and losing market share. It's not a good place. It's not great, and it's not good a place to be in. So, the first thing to recognize is it's good to have that information. So you must have chosen meaningful key performance indicators, and you must have collected data and reviewed that data, so you know that product performance isn't great and you're losing market share. So that's a good thing. The next thing then is to understand why is it happening, and how long has it been happening? Is it a trend? And if it's been a trend, okay, what can we do to change? And what you can do to change will, to a certain extent, depend on where your product is in its life cycle. So if you've launched an MVP and your product is underperforming, it might be an indication that your product strategy is wrong, that it's flawed. And so you may have to radically change the product strategy. You may have to pivot. Think of YouTube changing from an online dating website to a video sharing service, or think about, is it Flickr that started as a computer game and now is a photo sharing website? Yeah. So those are well-known post-launch pivots. Or Google Glass started as a consumer product that attracted a lot of interest and controversy, and now it's a B2B product that is for people who need their hands at work, like doctors, GPs, surgeons, and production line workers, for instance. So again, a pretty radical change, a post-launch pivot. So that might be required. If your product, however, has been around for a while, and you got to and you've experienced maybe months or maybe years of growth, then that's an indication that growth is starting to stagnate and your product is approaching maturity. And in that case, you have to ask yourself, well, should you allow your product to age gracefully and leverage it as a cash cow, assuming it's a revenue generating product, or should you extend its life cycle and rejuvenate it? And if you intend to extend its life cycle and move it back essentially into the growth stage, how are you going to do it? You're going to add new features? Are you going to radically improve the user experience? Are you significantly enhance existing features? Are you going to take it to a new market segment? Is it going to be a combination of those measures? But yes, I mean, product performance is down, particularly over weeks or months, and losing market share as a trend is never great. And so you really need to look into what are your options. If you have a young product and you've already pivoted once or twice, but still the product is not performing well, then you may have to retire it early. You may have to kill it early, and thereby saving yourself time, money, and energy that otherwise would be probably misinvested. So despite our best intentions, despite our best efforts, sometimes we can't make a product successful. We can't achieve product market fit. And in that case, it's important to recognize that and be honest to ourselves and have the courage then to kill our product at an early stage. Think of Google Wave, for instance, as one of many product examples that was launched with big ambitions and high hopes, but never managed to achieve product market fit and make it into the growth stage.
Thank you for that. And we'll take one last question from SN001 on YouTube. Is there a particular approach to developing a product strategy that you follow?
In a way, there is, yes. So, I mean, first of all, I find it's helpful to understand what a product strategy is and what information you want to capture in your product strategy. And there's no universally agreed definition, of a product strategy, but I like to suggest that you capture the problem you want to solve or the benefit you want to create in your strategy, that you capture the target group, the market segment, the audience who you want to address and who should benefit from having a problem removed or addressed, or having a benefit created. So those might be users, it might be users and customers. And then that you talk about what sets your product apart from maybe competing offerings and encourages people to choose it over those offerings. That's particularly important for end user facing products. And sort of list the 3 key features, 3 to 5 key features, standout features of your product. And finally, think about the business goals. What is the value that the product should create for the business? What are the desired business benefits? And again, just like with the roadmaps, if you want to try out some of my tools, some of my templates, a number of years ago, I created the product vision board, which, as its name suggests, allows you to capture the vision, and underneath the vision, then the product strategy and those 4 elements that I've mentioned. But there are other templates and tools out there. It's just important, I think, to reflect on what is a product strategy. What do I mean by a product strategy? What do we as an organization mean by a product strategy? What is the information we have to put in there? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is I have a strong preference to strategize in a collaborative fashion, involve the key stakeholders and development team representatives at an early stage in creating a product strategy, and then keeping them involved in validating that strategy. So I like to start with an initial good enough draft strategy, you could say, that is just testable, just about testable, where the statements are so specific that we can understand, are they likely to be true? Or maybe we're not quite sure, or maybe, statement sounds a little bit iffy or speculative, or a little bit risky. And then we know, okay, well, we need to validate that. We need to do something. We may have to carry out some direct observation or carry out some problem interviews with selected users. Maybe we have to do some competitive research and some competitive analysis in order to figure out if, say, we've chosen the right market segment, or if the problem is strong enough, or if we've got the right standout features, for instance. And again, do that together with the stakeholders and development team members, and then keep those individuals involved in reviewing and updating the strategy. And just like what I said about the product roadmap, I like to apply the same rule of thumb to the product strategy. And in fact, I like to combine a strategy review and a roadmap review. Number one, it reduces the amount of meetings that we go to, always tends to be a good thing. And secondly, the roadmap and the strategy really complement each other. They belong together in a way. I mean, there are 2 strategic plans that, as I said, go together. Strategy describes the overarching approach to achieve product success. And then the roadmap, the way I look at it, says these are the specific steps that we're taking to implement the strategy. So I like to review the 2 and update the 2 plans together. So, those are some of the techniques that you may want to consider, which I've also described in my book, Strategize. So maybe check that out.
Cool. And, thank you so much, Roman. And I know you have a hard stop and wanted to have a few minutes before this. Is there something additionally you'd like to comment on based on the questions you had so far, or the thoughts that come to your mind after all the questions?
First of all, thank you for all your questions, and thank you for listening and watching. That's been really interesting for me to hear your questions. I hope that the answers were a little bit useful. One of the great advancements I think we've seen in product management over the past 15 odd years is the amount of user data that we can collect these days, and we have readily available essentially at our fingertips. I think that is truly, truly brilliant. But I think what it's done for some of us, it's that it's kind of removed us from the users and customers. And I think as important and helpful as analytics tools and quantitative data are, it's equally important to be able to connect on a regular basis with selected users and customers through talking to people, interviewing them, observing them. Now, why am I mentioning this in the context of strategy and roadmap? Because my experience suggests that when people find it challenging to come up with an effective product strategy and also make meaningful product roadmap decisions, often that's rooted in a lack of understanding of the market and a lack of understanding of the users and customers and their needs. And I don't mean that people don't understand the market and the users and customers at all, but their understanding isn't deep enough. And so I really do think it's very worthwhile to ensure that you reach out regularly to people, and particularly before you make, or as in the process of making bigger strategic changes, you collect the necessary knowledge and you validate those changes then by reaching out to people in the right way. And the second thing I'd like to say is strategic decisions can be tough. Strategizing requires us to be willing to take informed risks. And when you take an informed risk in order to innovate, in order to create something new, in order to progress a product or create more value, there's a risk that we don't get things right, that we make a mistake, or that we fail. So that is part of the game. And so I think it's just important to be aware of that and kind of really actively embrace an entrepreneurial mindset, or an intrapreneurial mindset, if you want so. And say my job is to create more value with my product, or to maximize the value that product creates. In order to do so, it's helpful to think about product strategy and product roadmap. But as much as I try and leverage the knowledge I have about the users and customers and the data that we collect, and as much as I try and validate any decisions, there's still a risk that things might not work out. And that's just the way it is. So there is no kind of there's no fail-proof strategy. And as market conditions change, as customer, user, consumer behavior changes, as the competition changes, as technologies change, well, our strategies get outdated. And even if we try and update them and again try and make the best possible decisions, sometimes we just get it wrong. So that's again, probably something just to be aware of.
Thank you so much, Roman. And also thanks everyone in the community for joining us. Feel free to join our Telegram channel. We have weekly events, so we look forward to seeing you next week as well. Same time, same place, same channels. And with that, we can close the live stream. And for the people who are here, can stay